The conference room was full. 8 people around the table, 2 more on the video screen, all from Castleton Financial, one of the 3 most important clients our firm managed. I had spent 11 days preparing for that presentation. 11 days of research, cross-referencing data, rebuilding the revenue projection model from scratch because the previous version had gaps I didn't trust. I knew every number on every slide. I was 3 minutes into my section, explaining why the current allocation strategy was creating margin compression, when my boss, Neil, cut me off. Not a gentle interruption. A flat, dismissive one. He leaned forward and said, to the room, to the clients, "I think what she's trying to say is simpler than she's making it sound. The data actually tells a different story." He pulled up a slide I hadn't approved and started explaining a conclusion that contradicted my analysis entirely. The room went quiet. I felt heat rise in my face but kept my expression still. Then Philip Okafor, Castleton's head of strategy, raised one hand and said in a calm voice, "Actually, I think the original interpretation was correct. The margin compression point is exactly what our internal team flagged last quarter." The room shifted. Colleagues stared. I looked at the table and allowed myself one small, private smile. Neil recovered quickly, or tried to. He cleared his throat and said, without skipping much of a beat, "Well, at least someone here has some understanding of the numbers." He said it with a light laugh, like a casual observation. But the words landed exactly as intended, as a compliment pointed away from me, as if Philip's correction had been about the room generally rather than specifically about Neil being wrong and me being right. I kept my expression neutral. Philip gave Neil a brief, polite smile and said nothing more. The presentation continued. I finished my section without further interruption. When the meeting ended and the clients had filed out, Neil clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Good effort," in the tone of someone announcing a participation award. I thanked him in a voice that gave nothing away. Then I walked to the bathroom, locked the door, stood with my back against the wall, and stayed there for exactly 90 seconds. Not crying. Just breathing. And then, quietly and deliberately, I said to myself, "I will make this right." I didn't know every step of the plan yet. But I knew 2 things with certainty: I was right about the analysis. And this was not the first time. My name is Simone Wade. I was 31 years old and had been a senior financial analyst at Hargrove Consulting for 4 years. I came to the role with a postgraduate degree, 3 years of prior experience, and a work ethic that was more compulsion than choice. I was the person who checked her work twice before submitting it, then checked again at midnight from home. I was the person who stayed on client calls an extra 40 minutes when a question arose that nobody else could answer. I had 2 younger brothers I helped support financially, both still working their way through early careers. I had a gym membership I used maybe once a month because I was always at the office. I had missed 3 of my closest friends' birthday gatherings in 2 years because of project deadlines. I gave this job more than it ever gave back. I had known for at least a year that Neil's management style was a problem, not just for me, but for the whole team. But I had stayed quiet and worked harder, hoping results would matter more than politics. The Castleton meeting was the moment I understood that staying quiet was no longer a strategy. It had become a habit. And habits can be broken. The week after the Castleton presentation I started paying a different kind of attention. Not the careful technical kind focused on getting things right, a wider kind that noticed patterns. And the patterns, once I started looking, were everywhere. Neil had presented a market analysis to leadership 3 weeks earlier using a methodology I had developed and shared with him in an internal memo. He had not credited me. A project status report I had built from scratch in February had gone out under his name with 2 words changed in the summary section. 2 junior analysts had separately mentioned to me, in passing, that their ideas had appeared in external communications without attribution. And the task allocation pattern was clear once I mapped it: complex, high-risk deliverables came to me and the analysts with the least political capital, while visible, lower-stakes work stayed with Neil and his favorites. I started a document that evening. I called it simply, Notes. I wrote down everything I had observed with dates where I could recall them. I also began pulling copies of emails that showed a trail between my work and Neil's outputs. The folder grew faster than I expected. The following 2 weeks I made a deliberate decision about how to carry myself in that office. I would be visibly calm. Not falsely cheerful, just steady and unflustered regardless of what Neil said or did. I answered questions precisely and without defensiveness. I submitted work early when I could. I engaged with clients warmly and professionally. If Neil made a comment meant to diminish me, I acknowledged it briefly and moved on. My colleague Tund, who sat 3 desks away, stopped me one morning near the printer and said quietly, "You seem very calm for someone who had that meeting last week." I told him I was focused. He looked at me the way someone does when they suspect more is happening beneath the surface than you're showing. The effect on Neil was interesting. Because he had expected a reaction and wasn't getting one, he started overcompensating. In a private conversation near the kitchen that I overheard, he told the team lead that I lacked initiative and was going through the motions. I wrote down the exact phrase in my notes document that same afternoon. He had no idea his frustration with my silence was producing exactly the kind of statement I needed him to make. By the end of the 3rd week, my documentation folder had grown into something structured and substantial. I organized it across 5 sections. The first held copies of reports and analyses I had authored, with metadata intact showing creation dates and my account credentials. The second held internal emails showing where my work had been forwarded, presented, or modified without attribution. The third held a dated timeline of incidents, each described in 2 to 4 sentences with witnesses noted. The fourth held client communications, including Philip Okafor's correction at the Castleton meeting, which had been conducted over a shared call platform that automatically generated a transcript. That transcript sat in my folder, time-stamped, with his exact words preserved. The fifth section was a growing collection of errors, misstatements in client communications, budget figures that had gone out incorrectly, project timelines promised without any realistic basis. I reviewed the full folder one evening and felt the quiet satisfaction of a complex financial model that had finally balanced. One document in the fourth section had particular potential. I read it twice before closing the folder for the night, then added a short annotation to the document describing exactly how I intended to use it. The opportunity arrived in the 4th week during a project review meeting for a new client, a supply chain firm called Alderton Group. Neil was presenting the preliminary risk assessment. I had contributed the quantitative section. Midway through his explanation of the risk-weighting methodology, he described it incorrectly, saying the weights were applied sequentially when in fact they were applied simultaneously. A technical distinction, but it mattered, because the sequential version would have produced significantly different outputs. I waited until he finished the sentence. Then I said, in a measured and collaborative tone, just to add some clarity, the weights are actually applied simultaneously, which is why the model produces more conservative estimates than a sequential approach would. It's one of the things that makes the methodology reliable for this exposure type. 2 Alderton representatives nodded and wrote something down. Neil paused. I could see him processing whether to push back. He didn't. After the meeting, our colleague Beatrice pulled me aside in the corridor. "You let him have that very gracefully," she said. I told her I was just making sure the client had accurate information. She held my gaze for a moment and smiled slightly. Neil was in a particularly confident phase that month. He had been invited to speak at an industry forum on financial risk management, a visibility opportunity the managing partner had arranged, and he was preparing with energy that made clear he felt he was on an upward trajectory. He mentioned the forum repeatedly in team meetings and referenced it in client emails as though it were already a credential, as I'll be discussing at next month's forum. He asked me to prepare supporting research for his talk, which I did thoroughly, and which he accepted without acknowledgement of the preparation time involved. In one team meeting he made a comment I wrote down verbatim that evening. He said, gesturing at the team, "What I've built here is a real performance culture. I expect everyone to step up to my level." He looked directly at me when he said, "Step up." I looked back for exactly 1 second, then wrote in the margin of my notepad, timestamp, exact quote, "Witnesses present." 3 colleagues were in that room. 2 of them caught my eye briefly afterward. I added their names to the notes entry, along with a description of his expression. The forum was 6 weeks away. In the 5th week, I began drawing Neil's attention to errors in a way that was helpful on the surface but served a secondary purpose underneath. I started small. A client communication that had gone out from Neil's account with a currency figure in the wrong unit, millions where it should have been thousands. I flagged it in a team email as a quick clarification to make sure we're all aligned, copying the relevant client contact. He corrected it without thanking me. A week later, a project timeline he had shared with Alderton Group contained a dependency error, one task scheduled to begin before its prerequisite was complete. I mentioned it in the project channel during a routine check-in, phrased as a question, "Want to double-check the sequencing on Phase 2? Task 4 looks like it's starting before Task 3 closes out." Neil replied that he would review it. Each intervention was genuine, the errors were real and the corrections mattered. But the pattern, visible in the company's communication record, was building something, a picture of where the oversight was coming from and where it was consistently being caught. Alderton Group's project manager sent me a private message after the second incident. It said, "Good eye. Appreciate the attention to detail." I saved it to section 4 of my folder. The email arrived on a Thursday morning and I almost missed it. It had come in late the previous night. It was from Philip Okafor at Castleton Financial, copied to the general project inbox where Neil could see it. It was a response to a quarterly update Neil had sent the previous week. Philip wrote that he wanted to flag a discrepancy between the update's revenue projection and the original model presented at our meeting. The original model, he noted, had shown a more conservative estimate, one his team found more credible given their internal data, and he asked whether the update represented a revised methodology or a data entry issue. He ended, "The analysis we saw presented at our last meeting was exactly aligned with what we needed. We'd appreciate that level of precision going forward." The phrase, "the analysis we saw presented at our last meeting," was specific enough that anyone reading it would understand it referred to my section, the one Neil had interrupted, dismissed, and then been corrected on. I printed the email and added it to section 4. Neil sent Philip a reply that afternoon. He did not copy me on it. 2 weeks after Philip's email, the quarterly budget review came around. Neil had responsibility for consolidating the team's inputs into a master report that went to the managing partner. A formula in the consolidation spreadsheet was referencing an outdated data range, pulling figures from the previous quarter's actuals instead of the current one. The error produced a projected surplus overstated by roughly 18%. I noticed it when cross-checking the consolidated totals against my own team's input. The report was scheduled to go to the managing partner the following morning. I corrected the formula, updated the affected cells, and sent Neil a brief email flagging what I had found, confirming the corrected version was saved in the shared folder. He did not reply that night. In the morning the corrected report went up. Our colleague Tun stopped by my desk around 10 and said quietly, "I saw your email about the budget. Did he fix it or did you?" I told him I had found the issue and updated the file. Tund was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You saved him and he doesn't even know it yet." I told him to keep it between us. He nodded. Tund had been at the firm for 6 years. He was careful, observant, and deeply loyal to doing things correctly rather than to any particular person. After the budget conversation, something shifted between us. He started stopping by my desk more often, not with major revelations, just small observations. He mentioned when Neil had submitted a proposal with a client name misspelled, the error coming back from the managing partner's office. He told me when Neil had promised Alderton Group a deliverable date the team hadn't agreed to, creating pressure that fell on the junior analysts to resolve. He also told me something I hadn't known. At a senior staff dinner the previous month, Neil had made a comment about certain team members needing more guidance than others, and 2 people at the table had understood exactly who he meant. I added each piece to my notes with Tun's name as source. Then 2 days later, Tun told me something more urgent. He had seen a critical error in an Alderton Group deliverable going out that afternoon, one Alex, the junior analyst on the account, had made and that Neil had approved without reviewing carefully. I had 30 minutes to act. Alex had joined the team 8 weeks earlier. He was eager, smart in flashes, and still learning the difference between a model that looked correct and one that actually was. He had been assigned to the Alderton project as a development opportunity, with Neil nominally supervising his work. In practice, Neil reviewed Alex's outputs at a surface level and approved them quickly. When Tun flagged the error, I pulled up the file immediately. The issue was in the sensitivity analysis. Alex had used fixed input values where the model required variable ranges. The output looked plausible on the surface but would produce misleading conclusions under any scenario testing. I called Alex over quietly, showed him the issue, and walked him through the correct approach without going to Neil. I helped Alex rebuild the relevant section in 25 minutes. Then I sent a brief message to the project channel noting that a minor methodology refinement had been made to the sensitivity section before submission. The paper trail now showed the refinement. It also showed that Neil's approval had predated it, meaning he had signed off on the flawed version. That distinction was now part of the project record, and no one had needed to say a single accusatory word to put it there. 3 days after the Alderton deliverable, the client came back with feedback. The response was mostly positive. They appreciated the structure and clarity of the recommendations. But one line near the end stood out. Their project lead wrote that in reviewing the sensitivity section, they had flagged one scenario output as inconsistent with their internal assumptions, and asked for clarification on the methodology. The section they were asking about was the original version Neil had approved before I helped Alex correct it. Neil had already sent the revised version as part of the final package, so there was no live error to explain. But the client's question pointed clearly at the work Neil had reviewed and passed. Neil sent a reply explaining the methodology without mentioning the revision or Alex. He wrote it in first person, as though he had been the one who had caught and resolved the issue. I read his reply in the shared inbox. Then I opened my folder, added the client's query, Neil's reply, and the timestamp of my channel message that predated both. Tun sent me a message that afternoon. Just 3 words, people are noticing. I replied with one, good. That weekend I completed the documentation package. I went through every section, verified every date, and checked every claim against the source material behind it. I added a new section, a 1-page executive summary presenting the pattern in plain language, a list of incidents, their dates, their consequences, and who had caught or corrected each problem. The summary used no emotional language and did not characterize Neil personally. It described actions and outcomes. I included Philip Okafor's email, the corrected budget report with its email trail, the Alderton project channel messages showing the revision timeline, and the auto-generated call transcript from the Castleton meeting. I printed the package and read it back as someone seeing it for the first time. The pattern was unmistakable, not because I had arranged it, but because it was real and the records were honest. I had one more thing to do. I needed a meeting with the managing partner, a woman named Constance, who ran the firm with the kind of precision that told you she had seen most things before and was not easily impressed by anything not backed by evidence. I sent her meeting request on Sunday evening. She accepted before Monday morning arrived. 2 days before my meeting with Constance, Neil ran the all-team project status update, a monthly call that included 2 client observers from Alderton Group. Neil opened by presenting a project completion percentage I knew was wrong. He said the Alderton engagement was 73% complete. The actual figure, based on the project tracker we all maintained, was 61%. I had updated my section of the tracker that same morning. The gap wasn't rounding, it was 12 points, enough to set very different expectations for the remaining timeline. One of the Alderton observers, a woman named Claudette, asked which phases were included in the completion figure. Neil answered in general terms. Claudette pushed back gently, saying their internal tracking showed a lower figure and asking if there was a reconciliation she had missed. Neil said he would follow up after the call. He never looked at me during this exchange. But 3 colleagues did. After the call ended and the clients dropped off, the room went briefly quiet in the way that means everyone is thinking the same thing but nobody is saying it. I opened my notes application and typed for 2 straight minutes. The next morning I sent a project status memo to the full team and Alderton Group contacts. I framed it as a mid-quarter alignment note, a format I had used before, so it didn't appear unusual. I included the correct completion percentage with a clear breakdown by phase, showing exactly which milestones were done, in progress, or not yet started. I included the updated timeline and a plain language explanation of what the remaining work required. The memo was thorough, clean, and exact. Claudette replied within the hour saying the breakdown was exactly what their team needed and that it aligned with their own tracking. She copied her manager on the reply. Neil also replied, in a separate thread, calling the memo a useful supplement. That phrase was his way of repositioning it as a secondary addition to his presentation rather than a correction of it. But the client's response made the sequence clear to anyone reading the threads in order. 3 colleagues replied to the memo with brief positive notes. Tons said, "This is the most complete status summary we've put together this quarter." I forwarded the full thread to my personal email and added it to my folder. Everything I needed was now in place. The consequences of the status error arrived more quickly than I expected. Constance, the managing partner, had been a silent observer on the all-team call, something Neil had either forgotten or not known. I discovered this from her assistant when confirming my meeting time. She had apparently noted the discrepancy between Neil's completion figure and the client's response in real time, and when she followed up with the project tracking system, the recorded figure was 61%, exactly as I had documented in my folder. As a result, Neil's year-end performance bonus, tied partly to client satisfaction and project accuracy metrics, was adjusted downward. He was not told the specific reason initially, just that the review had identified a metric variance. But the effect was immediate. He came into the office the following Monday looking like someone who had spent the weekend on the wrong side of a very uncomfortable conversation. He called a short team meeting and spent 20 minutes talking about the importance of precise communication and unified messaging. He looked at no one specific and at everyone at once. He scanned the room with the particular discomfort of someone who suspected they were being watched but couldn't identify exactly where to look. I took careful notes throughout and kept my expression entirely neutral. Over the following 2 weeks, incidents began surfacing more publicly, not because I was pushing them, but because the environment had changed and people were paying closer attention. A junior analyst named Remy flagged an error in a client report in the team channel before it went out. It was an error Neil had introduced when editing Remy's draft. Remy framed it as a question, but the implication was clear to anyone reading carefully. 2 days later, Tund pointed out in a project meeting that a client deadline Neil had confirmed publicly was 2 days earlier than the actual contract date, and that the team needed to work to the contract deadline to avoid scope confusion. Neil accepted the correction but his response was curt. Then Beatrice, on an Alderton Group status call, was asked directly by Claudette to walk through the remaining deliverables. She did so accurately and in full detail, without deferring once to Neil for confirmation. These moments were small individually. Together they marked something significant. The team had stopped looking to Neil as the reliable source of accurate information and had quietly begun working around him rather than through him. Office conversations grew more frequent and quieter. People spoke in small groups near the windows rather than at the central table where Neil usually held court. The shift in how the team related to me was gradual but unmistakable. People sought me out not just for technical questions but for judgment calls. Remy came to my desk twice in 1 week to discuss an approach before submitting anything to Neil. Beatrice asked me to review a client deck before it went to the managing partner's office. Even Kofi, a senior analyst who had been at the firm 9 years and moved with great self-sufficiency, stopped by one afternoon to ask my opinion on a risk classification question. I answered everyone the same way, directly, specifically, and without any reference to Neil's handling of anything. I wanted the collaboration to be genuine, not political. But Tund put it plainly one afternoon while we were making coffee. He said, "The team has figured out who to go to when they need something done right. You didn't have to say a word." I stirred my coffee and didn't reply for a moment. Then I said, "I just kept showing up and doing the work." He looked at me with a slight smile and said, "That's the whole strategy, isn't it?" I met his eyes. "That's the whole strategy," I said. I had my meeting with Constance on a Thursday afternoon. She kept me waiting 4 minutes in the corridor, a habit Tund had told me she maintained to observe how people handled small discomfort. I stood with my folder, checked my phone once for the time, and stood still after that. When I went in she was already seated. She gestured at the chair across from her without looking up. When she did look up, she held my gaze for a moment before speaking. I had prepared for this meeting the way I prepared for client presentations, with a clear structure and evidence that did not require interpretation. I placed the printed package on her desk and said, I wanted to share some observations about project quality and client communication patterns over the past 3 months. I've documented the key incidents with sources. She picked up the package and began reading. She turned pages slowly. She asked 3 questions, all of them precise. I answered each one without over-explaining. When she finished, she set the package down. How long have you been compiling this? She asked. I told her 8 weeks. She nodded once. Leave this with me, she said. The meeting that followed mine was between Constance and Neil. I don't know everything that was said in that room. But I know it lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes, Tun timed it, and I know what Neil's face looked like when the door opened. I know that Constance's assistant sent a follow-up email to the full senior team requesting all project documentation and client communication records be submitted to the managing partner's office for a standard quarterly review. This review format had not been used in the previous 6 quarters. And I know what happened in the brief all-hands meeting Constance called the following morning. She stood at the front and spoke for about 10 minutes, about standards, attribution, the firm's obligation to clients. She did not name Neil specifically. But she said one thing that landed precisely: the quality of this firm's work has always been determined by the people who do it carefully, not by the people who present it loudly. She looked at the room evenly. I kept my expression composed. Neil sat 2 chairs to my right with his hands flat on the table and his jaw set in the way that told me exactly how well he understood what had just been said. The formal acknowledgement came 11 days later. Constance called me into her office for a second meeting. She said the review had confirmed concerns about project oversight and client communication accuracy over the past several months. She said the firm intended to restructure the team's senior leadership model going forward. She offered me the position of lead senior analyst, a newly created role carrying formal oversight responsibility for all client-facing deliverables and direct reporting access to the managing partner's office. The salary attached was a 31% increase from my current level. I accepted in that meeting, calmly and without theatrics. I thanked her and said I looked forward to building on what the team was already doing well. She said she expected results and set a 30-day review. I told her she would have them. On my way back to my desk, I passed Neil in the corridor. He was carrying a stack of folders and moving in the opposite direction, head down. He gave me a small, stiff nod when he noticed me. I nodded back in kind. Neither of us said anything beyond that brief acknowledgement. We kept walking in our separate directions. That silence, I thought, was actually the most honest exchange we had ever managed to have with each other. Neil's trajectory after the review was visible in details rather than any single dramatic event. He was removed from direct client oversight on the Alderton Group account. That responsibility shifted to me. The Castleton financial relationship was also realigned. Philip Okafor's team was assigned a new primary contact, me. Neil retained a role on the team, but his scope narrowed significantly. The forum speaking invitation he had been preparing for with such visible pride was quietly withdrawn by the managing partner's office on grounds of scheduling conflicts. He continued showing up and completing assigned work, but the loud confidence he had carried for months was gone. He spoke less in meetings, reviewed fewer documents under his own authority. Tun told me Neil had called in sick 3 times in one 2-week period, which was unusual for him. I didn't track his decline closely because I didn't need to. I had real work to do, and the work was genuinely engaging now in a way it hadn't been in over a year. I had a team that brought me real questions and trusted the answers. People who came to me because they wanted to get things right. That was more than enough. Months later, on a quiet Friday evening when the office had mostly emptied, I sat at my desk finishing a report for Castleton Financial. The floor was still. The city outside had gone into that particular orange light that only happens at the end of autumn days. I thought about the conference room where all of this had started, Neil interrupting me mid-sentence, Philip Okafor raising his hand, the room going quiet, the small private smile I had allowed myself while looking at the table. I had walked out of that meeting furious in a way I had shown to nobody. And I had made a choice, in a bathroom with my back against the wall, to turn that fury into something precise. Not performance. Not politics. Just evidence. Just work. Just the steady, documented, irrefutable proof that the analysis was right, that the work was mine, and that eventually the right people would see it clearly. The promotion had been a confirmation, not a destination. The real thing I had needed to know was simpler. I had been right. I had been right all along. I had not let the humiliation make me loud or reckless. I had let it make me thorough. That, I thought, as I closed the report and put on my jacket, was the only revenge worth having. Respect yourself. Plan carefully. And let the work say everything that needs to be said.